There is a particular kind of silence that settles over old mill towns, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of things that were built to last and then outlasted the people who built them. Walk the banks of the Blackstone River in Rhode Island or follow the Merrimack north through Massachusetts, and you will find the bones of buildings that once ran on water and wool, and the unrecorded labor of families whose names are scattered now across a dozen states. The brick walls are still standing. Mill races are still cut into the riverbanks. The counting houses where fortunes were recorded in ledger books now hold coffee shops and art galleries and condominium units, and the people who pass through them every morning have no idea what names were written into the deeds that originally claimed that ground. What most people do not know is that the surnames attached to those mills, the families who financed them, managed them, married into them, and in some cases died inside them, were not the random accumulation of a growing industrial economy. They were a specific group. A tightly connected network of family lines whose presence at the founding of American textile manufacturing was no coincidence, and whose genealogical threads run through the ancestry of more Americans today than any history textbook has ever fully acknowledged. 14 surnames in particular appear again and again in the earliest mill records, the land transfer documents, the partnership agreements, and the probate files of New England's first industrial decade. Slater, Lowell, Appleton, Jackson, Cabot, Lawrence, Ames, Dudley, Perkins, Tiffany, Dexter, Brown, Almy, Wilkinson. Some of those names will feel familiar. A few carry the weight of institutional legacy, colleges and hospitals and city streets bearing their marks across the Northeast. Others have faded so completely from the common record that the families who carry them today have no idea they are holding a piece of American industrial origin in their own surname. This is the story of those 14 lines, what they shared, how they connected, why the network they built shaped the geography of American commerce for a century, and why their descendants are scattered across the country in ways the family history does not quite explain. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The beginning of American textile manufacturing is usually dated to 1793, when a young English mechanic named Samuel Slater reproduced the spinning frame from memory in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, in partnership with the merchant firm of Almy and Brown. That is the official story, and it is not wrong. But it is incomplete in the way that founding myths are always incomplete, because what allowed Slater's machinery to run was not ingenuity alone. It was money, and the money came from a specific family network that had been quietly consolidating commercial power in New England for the better part of a century before the first spindle turned. William Almy and Moses Brown were Quakers, members of a religious and commercial community that placed enormous value on in-group trust and endogamous partnership. The Brown family of Providence had been trading since the 1600s, building a mercantile empire that extended from the Rhode Island coast through the Caribbean, before Moses Brown's public moral rupture with the slave trade in the 1770s. The Almy family had intermarried with Browns, with Wilkinsons, with Perkinses across 2 generations of Providence County Quaker meeting records. By the time Slater arrived from England with the architecture of the water frame in his head, he was not walking into an open market. He was walking into a family. Oziel Wilkinson, whose daughter Hannah would become Slater's wife, was an ironmaster in Pawtucket, who provided the metal components for the first mill machinery. This is documented in the Slater business correspondence held at the Rhode Island Historical Society, where the earliest letters between the partners discuss the difficulty of sourcing precision metal parts from anyone outside the local Quaker craftsman network. His son David Wilkinson went on to develop the screw-cutting lathe, a tool that made precision mechanical replication possible and whose importance to the spread of American manufacturing across the Northeast cannot be overstated. David received a patent for his lathe in 1808, and within a decade, versions of his design were in use in machine shops from Providence to Waltham. When you trace the Wilkinson line back through Rhode Island probate records, you find them connected to Almy's through marriage in the 1750s, and to Brown's through commercial partnership in the 1770s. The mill was not an invention. It was a family project, executed by people who had been preparing the ground for it across 2 generations of accumulated capital and carefully arranged alliance. This is the genealogical pattern that defines every one of the 14 surnames on this list. They were not independent actors who happened to converge on textile manufacturing because the economics were favorable. They were a web of interconnected families, many of them Quaker or Congregationalist, most of them with roots in the same cluster of Rhode Island and eastern Massachusetts counties, who transferred capital, technology, personnel, and marriage partners among themselves across 3 generations of industrial expansion. When Francis Cabot Lowell traveled to England in 1810 and memorized the design of the power loom during his visits to the textile mills of Lancashire, he was not acting alone. He returned to a network that was prepared to receive what he brought back. He formed the Boston Manufacturing Company with his brother-in-law Patrick Tracy Jackson and with the merchant Nathan Appleton in 1813. The Lowells and Appletons and Jacksons had been moving in overlapping social and commercial circles since the 1770s, connected through the same Boston merchant houses, the same social clubs, the same Congregationalist church communities on the North Shore of Massachusetts. The mills at Waltham, and later at the city that took Lowell's name, were not the products of individual genius. They were the outcome of a specific family alliance executing a plan that had been decades in formation, waiting only for the technological piece to arrive. What the census records from 1810 through 1850 show, when you map the residential addresses of the mill company directors against each other, is a geographic clustering so tight it would be unusual even for a small ethnic enclave. Many of the Lowell Company directors lived within a few streets of each other in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. Several sent their children to the same private schools. Multiple families shared the same attorneys, the same physicians, the same church pews at King's Chapel and the Old South Meeting House. The Cabots, who had made their money in maritime trade and privateering and moved into textile investment in the 18-teens, were connected to the Lowells through Francis Cabot Lowell's own name, his mother Rebecca having been born a Cabot before her marriage. The surname Francis carried in the middle of his name was not incidental. It was a genealogical credential, a declaration of the network he belonged to, worn where everyone who read the partnership documents could see it. The Lawrence brothers, Amos and Abbott, who financed the mills at the city that bears their name, were connected to the Appleton network through the commercial firm of Appleton and Lawrence, which operated out of Boston's State Street from the 1820s onward. Their commercial correspondence, portions of which are held at the Massachusetts Historical Society, shows a pattern of mutual investment and oversight that reads less like a business partnership and more like a family trust, because that is in effect what it was. When the city of Lawrence was incorporated in 1847, named for the brothers who had provided the capital to build it, the act of naming was also an act of genealogical commemoration. The city's varied geography, the canal system, the street grid, the placement of the mill buildings along the Merrimack reflected decisions made by a specific family alliance whose members knew each other not merely as business partners but as relatives, as fellow communicants, as people who had attended the same funerals and the same ordinations for the same shared dead. The Ames family of Easton, Massachusetts presents a slightly different genealogical profile, but one that fits the same structural pattern. The Ameses were not textile mill owners in the Lowell or Slater sense. They were toolmakers, operators of the old colony ironworks whose shovels and agricultural implements equipped the westward expansion of the mid-19th century. But in the 1840s and 1850s, as the textile industry required more sophisticated machinery and more precise component manufacture, the Ames manufacturing network became a supplier to the mill economy, and the family's financial connections to the Lawrence Group in particular are documented in the Bristol County deed records at Taunton. Oliver Ames, who would later serve as president of the Union Pacific Railroad, was connected by marriage to families whose commercial interests ran through the same northern Massachusetts mill towns that the Lowell Group had built. The Ames surname in New England Ancestry today carries a manufacturing genealogy that runs deeper than the shovel trade for which the family is most commonly remembered. The Dudley and Dexter surnames occupy a different position in this genealogical network. The Dudleys of Worcester County appear in the mill records not as investors but as managers, a pattern that reflects a social division within the network itself. The Lowell-Appleton Cabot tier represented old mercantile money-financing industrial infrastructure from a distance, from counting houses on State Street rather than from mill offices on the factory floor. Below them in the organizational structure sat families who managed the daily operations of specific mills, who lived in the mill towns rather than in Boston, and who intermarried with the local managerial class rather than with the merchant families above them. The Dudleys and Dexters show up in this layer consistently across the records. Timothy Dexter, the eccentric Newburyport merchant whose family name appears in early Essex County mill records from the 1790s, had accumulated capital through wartime provisioning and land speculation, and that capital moved into textile manufacturing through the commercial connections of the extended Dexter family network of Bristol County, where the surname appears in mill partnership records from as early as 1798. What makes the Tiffany surname remarkable in this context is how far it traveled from its New England origin, and what that travel implies about the dispersal of the founding mill network's descendants into commerce and culture far removed from the original manufacturing base. The Tiffany's of Providence are documented in Rhode Island commercial records from the 1700s, connected to the Brown and Almy commercial world through the overlapping Quaker and Baptist merchant communities of Providence County. The jeweler Charles Louis Tiffany, born in Killingly, Connecticut in 1812, was the son of a cotton mill owner. His father, Comfort Tiffany, operated a cotton mill in the Quinnebog Valley, a region where the Slater mill model had been replicated through the networks already described. When Charles Tiffany moved to New York and established the luxury goods firm that still carries his name, he was drawing on capital and commercial connections whose genealogical roots ran directly back into the Rhode Island founding textile network. The name on the blue box is, in that sense, a piece of American industrial genealogy that the official Tiffany history has never fully acknowledged. What the physical geography of the 14 surnames reveals, when you overlay their documented residences against the river systems of New England, is that the mill economy was not built on any river, but on specific rivers selected for specific hydraulic reasons by people who had surveyed those rivers, in some cases before the Revolutionary War was even concluded. The Blackstone, the Merrimack, the Pawtuxet, the Charles, the Quinnebog, and the Taunton rivers all appear in the early mill site documentation, and the surnames attached to the first mills on each of those rivers are drawn almost entirely from the 14 family lines described here. This was not coincidence produced by proximity. These families knew each other. They had been exchanging commercial correspondence and sharing transport vessels and insuring each other's cargoes for decades before the first mill was built. The decision to put a mill on a particular stretch of river was a family decision before it was a commercial one, made by people who trusted each other because they had grown up in the same meeting houses and had buried their parents in the same church graveyards. The social architecture of the founding mill network is visible not only in the partnership agreements, but in the secondary documents that historians have largely left unexamined. The wills of the founding generation, probated in the county courts of Providence, Essex, Middlesex, and Bristol between 1790 and 1840, show a pattern of cross-family bequest and trusteeship that reinforces the genealogical picture in the commercial records. A Cabot named as trustee over a Lowell estate, a Perkins appointed executor for a Brown will, an Appleton serving as guardian for a Lawrence orphan. These appointments required the kind of trust that only comes from sustained genealogical connection, from the knowledge that the person you are naming has standing in the same community, shares the same obligations, and will still be accountable to the same network when your own children come of age. The wills are genealogical documents dressed as legal ones, and they are sitting in the county probate archives, largely unread by anyone tracing the family history of these 14 surnames. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The commercial correspondence of the founding period is equally revealing about the network's internal geography. Letters between the Boston Manufacturing Company and the Almy and Brown firm, between the Lawrence Commercial House and the Jackson family offices, between Perkins and Cabot and their various agents and managers, show a circulation of personnel and capital that moved along family lines before it moved along market lines. When a mill needed a new superintendent, the first call went to a family connection. When capital needed to be raised for a new building, the first subscription list went to the same surnames that had funded the previous expansion. The network was self-funding and self-staffing, and it remained so for 3 generations, until the sheer scale of the later Lowell and Lawrence enterprises required capital from outside the founding family web, and the network began, slowly, to dilute itself into the broader market. The Perkins family requires particular attention because their surname appears in the founding mill records in 2 distinct capacities that illuminate how the network replicated itself across social classes and across generations. Thomas Handicid Perkins, the Boston merchant known in the China trade, was not himself a textile manufacturer. He was a maritime commerce specialist who accumulated capital through trade in Canton goods and moved that capital into textile investment in the 1810s and 1820s, joining the Lowell Company network through his commercial associations with the Cabot and Jackson families. A separate branch of the Perkins family, centered in the Connecticut River Valley and documented in the Hampshire County records of western Massachusetts, contributed supervisory and mechanical personnel to mill operations throughout the region. When you trace both branches through the genealogical record, you find them converging in Rhode Island in the 1760s through marriage connections that link them to the Almy and Brown networks, at the moment those networks were first consolidating their manufacturing ambitions. The two Perkins branches appear to have diverged from a common Rhode Island origin point, one moving toward merchant capital and one toward mechanical superintendents, each serving a different function within the same founding industrial network. The Brown family name presents the greatest genealogical complexity of the 14 because of its sheer prevalence in New England records. Moses Brown of Providence was a member of the Brown family that had founded what became Brown University, had engaged in the Atlantic slave trade, and had accumulated some of the largest mercantile wealth in pre-revolutionary New England. Moses Brown's turn toward textile manufacturing in the 1780s and 1790s was in part a deliberate moral and commercial redirection following his public break with the slave trade in 1773, a conversion that made him one of the most prominent Quaker abolitionists in the colonies. Before that designation had a name. The partnership with Almy and then with Slater was the result of his search for a commercial enterprise that did not depend on enslaved labor. The Almy and Brown business correspondence at the Rhode Island State Archives documents this moral arithmetic with a directness that the official history of the firm has not always preserved. The genealogical reach of the Brown family beyond the Moses Brown line is enormous, and the commercial connections between the various Brown family networks of Rhode Island and those of Massachusetts and Connecticut mean that a Brown surname in New England ancestry today carries a higher probability of connection to this founding industrial network than the simple commonness of the name might suggest. The Lowell name carries a particular genealogical weight because of the institutional proliferation that followed from Francis Cabot Lowell's death in 1817 at the age of 42, before the mills at the city that would bear his name were even built. He died having established the pattern, having demonstrated at Waltham that the integrated power loom mill could work, and having assembled the capital network and the family alliance that his successors would use to scale the model across the Merrimack Valley. The Lowell Institute, endowed by his nephew John Lowell Jr. in 1836, funded public lectures in Boston for a century and a half. Nathan Appleton's daughter Fanny married Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in 1843, making the poet a figure in the same family network that had built the mills, a fact that gives a different resonance to certain of his New England subjects. When genealogists trace the Lowell surname through New England records, they find it concentrated in a narrow geographic band running from Boston north through the Merrimack Valley, a distribution that maps almost exactly onto the geography of the first generation of power loom mills. What the genealogical record of all 14 surnames shows, when you map their marriage patterns against each other across 3 generations, is a degree of endogamy that was deliberate. These families married each other, repeatedly, in a pattern that sustained the concentration of industrial capital within a bounded social group, and that made the network self-reinforcing in ways that purely commercial partnerships could never be. A Cabot daughter married a Lowell son. A Perkins cousin married into the Jackson family. An Appleton niece married a Lawrence nephew. The genealogical database of New England marriages in the period from 1780 to 1850 shows this pattern with a clarity that the official histories of American industrialization have consistently underemphasized. The founding of the American textile industry was not merely a commercial event. It was a genealogical event, a deliberate consolidation of family wealth and family alliance that shaped the structure of the American economy for the next century. Mill records themselves tell a more complex story than the founding myth acknowledges, because alongside the 14 surnames of the investor and managerial class, the records contain tens of thousands of other names. The mill girls of Lowell, the young women from rural Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine who came to work the power looms in the 1820s and 1830s, left their names in the payroll books and in the boarding house records, and in the letters they sent home to families who kept them in cedar chests and attic trunks. The Irish immigrant families who replaced them after the famine of the 1840s left their names in the naturalization records and the Catholic Church registries of Lawrence and Lowell and Fall River. The French-Canadian families who came south from Quebec to work the later mills left their names in the civil records of the mill towns and in the registers of the Franco-American parishes that still stand in some of those communities. These names are not in the partnership agreements. They are not in the probate files of the investor class. But they are in the records, and they are the records of the people who ran the machines that made the 14 founding surnames wealthy. The Appleton name illustrates perhaps most clearly how these 14 surnames dispersed as the textile economy matured and then contracted. Nathan Appleton's descendants moved into law, politics, and literature. His son William Appleton served in Congress. The commercial Appleton network extended south through New York and west through Ohio as the second and third generations of the family moved away from direct manufacturing involvement and into the financial and legal infrastructure that sustained it. An Appleton surname appearing in Ohio or Illinois or Indiana census records from 1850 or 1860 does not mean the connection to the founding mill network is severed. It means the network migrated, carrying the surname westward along the same commercial routes that carried the textile capital out of New England and into the expanding economy of the interior. The same migration pattern is visible in the Jackson and Lawrence names. Patrick Tracy Jackson's descendants appear in Michigan and Minnesota records by the 1870s. The Lawrence family's mercantile connections extended the surname into the commercial cities of the Midwest within a generation of the mill city's founding. When you trace these 14 surnames through the westward migration patterns of the mid-19th century, you find them following the routes of the same commercial networks that had sustained them in New England, moving along the Erie Canal corridor, settling in the Great Lakes manufacturing towns, appearing in the county histories of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois with the same institutional affiliations they had carried from Massachusetts. The physical traces of the 14 surnames are still visible in the landscape of New England and in the archives that serve it. The Slater mill in Pawtucket is now a museum, its original machinery preserved behind glass. The Lowell National Historical Park preserves the canal system and several of the original mill buildings along the Merrimack. The Lawrence Heritage State Park holds the remnants of the Ames textile complex. The church records of the Quaker meetings in Providence and the Congregationalist churches of Essex County still hold the baptism and marriage entries that document the family connections among the 14 founding lines. The county deed records of Bristol, Providence, Essex, and Middlesex counties contain the land transfers through which the Lowell and Lawrence networks assembled the mill sites. The National Archives holds the patent records under which David Wilkinson and the Ames family and the mechanical inventors connected to these 14 family lines secured their claims. The Baker Library at Harvard holds the Boston Manufacturing Company records, the minute books and the stock transfer ledgers and the correspondence files that trace the movement of capital and personnel through the Lowell network across 4 decades. The genealogical story of the American textile mill has 2 parallel tracks that run alongside each other through the same archival collections without ever fully meeting. The story of the 14 founding surnames who owned and directed the mills is the story of a specific family network executing an industrial strategy across 3 generations. The story of the workers who ran the machines is the story of a much larger and more diverse group of families whose connection to the mill economy was mediated by wages rather than by ownership, and whose surnames do not appear in the partnership agreements or the probate files of the investor class. The DNA test today returns a result showing New England ancestry. The question of whether that ancestry connects to the founding network or to the working population it employed is a question that the genealogical record can sometimes answer, but only if you know which archives to read and which surnames to look for. The commercial genetic testing companies that now process millions of samples per year have good data on the population genetics of New England, but they are reading that data against modern reference populations, and their results are strongest for the last 2 or 3 centuries of mixing and migration. The deeper story of why specific New England surnames cluster in specific geographic patterns, why a Perkins or a Cabot or an Almy shows up in Illinois or Minnesota or California with no apparent reason for being there, is not something a pie chart in an app can answer. It requires the county deed records, the church registries, the probate files, the commercial correspondence, and the payroll ledgers. It requires knowing that the 14 founding surnames of the American textile industry moved as a network, and that when one branch of the network migrated west, it often migrated toward another branch that had arrived before it. The clustering you see in the census records of the Midwest in the 1850s and 1860s is not random. It is the founding network dispersed but still partially cohering, still pulling its members toward each other along the roots of old commercial alliance and old family obligation. None of this material is hidden. It is simply unread by the millions of Americans whose surnames appear somewhere in these documents and who have no idea that the name they carry was once a marker of a specific commercial and genealogical network that built the first American factories and then sent its descendants across a continent. If your surname is Slater or Almy or Wilkinson, the genealogical path back to the Pawtucket Mill is short and well documented, running through the Rhode Island probate records and the Almy and Brown business correspondence at the Rhode Island State Archives. If your surname is Appleton or Jackson or Lowell or Lawrence, the path runs through the Boston Manufacturing Company records at the Baker Library and through the city directories of the Merrimack Valley towns from the 1820s through the 1880s. If your name is Cabot, or Perkins, or Ames, or Dudley, or Dexter, or Tiffany, or Brown, the path is somewhat longer, running through the merchant and manufacturing networks of Bristol and Essex and Providence counties before it arrives at the mill records themselves. But for all 14 surnames, the path exists. The documentation is there. The silence over the old mill towns is not the silence of lost history. It is the silence of history that is sitting in the archives, in manuscript boxes and on microfilm reels, waiting for the person who carries one of these 14 surnames to come and read what the record contains about the family they came from and the world those families made. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.